The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm Melissa Miller, I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm a science writer writing for Star Wars Insider magazine.
And I'm James Floyd, your other co-host. I also freelance for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about urban ecology in Star Wars as exemplified by the wildlife in such settled places as Mos Eisley and Coruscant. Our guest expert today is Sawyer Markham, a herpetology grad student at New York University, who also has been making educational Star Wars science videos on TikTok. Hi, Sawyer.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us what urban ecology is and how does that fit into the overall study of wildlife biology?
Yeah, so it's like a two-part answer, right? I think that at its core, urban ecology focuses on the interconnected relationships of different species that occupy urban spaces. If you didn't know, by 2050, almost 98% of the population should be living in what is considered an urban space. And because of that, wildlife has had to adapt to urbanization. So it's really just a study of how these species are adapting and surviving as human demographics change and the human population grows. And then the second part of it, I think, is also learning how humans can and should coexist with these species, because in a lot of cases, they were here first, and in a lot of cases, they are at more risk than we are when it comes to climate change and things like that.
Well, and we've been talking about ecology and animals and stuff like that a lot in the recent episodes. And I know in our environmental apocalypse episode, we definitely talked about Coruscant, where there's not really an environment left. I'm sort of curious, since you mentioned you're a herpetology student, that's, reptiles and amphibians, right? On our planet now, is there a lot of, secret city lizards and stuff like that? What do you study?
Absolutely. Yeah, I study lizards predominantly. But for a while there, I was working as a lead on a project at the Field Museum in Chicago, and my job was to go to different urban parks and, walking trails and stuff like that. We would also do some hunting in the U Chicago campus and whatnot, and I was just blown away at how many reptiles and amphibians, a lot of amphibians over there in the Midwest, are just hiding out in big cities like that. And now I'm in New York, and we've got our fair share of critters, and I went to college in Florida, so there's endless possibilities over there. So yeah, lots of city lizards. One thing that I find so interesting is that there is a almost endangered species in Florida of a knoll lizard that has thrived in invasive populations in Hawaii in urban locations, which is not something you tend to think about when you think of a species being close to being endangered. You're like, oh no, what's wrong? But now they're over in Hawaii thriving. They're not supposed to be there. So there's a lot of intersectionality in urban ecology and different areas of study. But yes, lots of city lizards for sure.
Well, what would be some good examples in Star Wars of what you might be looking at in urban ecology?
That's a great question. For some reason, the first thing that I think of is Mandalorian season 3 with the Kowakian monkey lizards just hanging out. I think a lot of times in Star Wars, you think of planets like Dagobah and Tatooine, and they aren't densely populated by people, and therefore all of the wildlife is pretty native, with the exception of Sarlaccs, because they're very invasive. We haven't seen a ton of examples in Star Wars that I can think of critters in the cities. This is not a case of like rancors being sold and kept in cities and whatnot.
Definitely, we see even in A New Hope, the special editions, they added like little scurriers to the outside of Mos Eisley when you go in. So you see like little vermin and stuff just hanging out.
Yeah. When you said Mos Eisley, I definitely picture that as more like, and maybe this is more the like Mos Espa or whatever, where there's, a crate dragon burrowing through Main Street. But I really picture those more as still Wild West, still the cougars roaming around. But I guess anywhere you have human trash and, people not paying attention and stuff like that, you're going to get this sort of rat or pigeon sort of equivalence maybe in Star Wars. I'd love to see more things like that.
There's got to be some really gross things lurking in the Undercity of Coruscant for sure.
I know we sometimes see like the tuca cats, which loth cats are a subspecies of, but I'm sure there's also feral cats, just like there are
Oh,
feral
yeah.
cats on Earth.
Do
Oh,
we have a
yeah.
TNR policy in Coruscant?
In one of the Forces of Destiny shorts, this little girl gets busted by stormtroopers for having a tuca cat, and then Jyn Erso comes back and saves the day and takes out the stormtroopers with the help of the cat. So apparently there's some imperial regulations on having feral cats, basically. But of course, that could be stormtroopers just stirring up trouble.
What is TNR?
Oh, trap, neuter, release.
Ah, where they put the little like
Yeah.
clip in their ear type of thing.
Yeah, they tagged the ear of the cat. I got into a situation in Miami once where somebody that I was with wanted to take a feral cat home, and I was like, no, put it in the car, drove it to the shelter. We're gonna TNR this bad boy, make sure. Because, I mean, a lot of people don't even realize that feral cats can wipe out entire species,
Mhm.
especially of lizards and birds.
Mm. Yeah, no, I would honestly love to see that in Star Wars. Like the next time we're on Coruscant, outside the Jedi Temple or something like that,
Some animal control.
Yeah, I mean, animal control or just, an obvious feral animal situation, something like that, scurry by. I think that'd be really fun. The only thing I could think of was from Terrell Whitlatch's wildlife book on Coruscant, toilet Dianoga, basically. We know they like trash water, so like living in
Mm.
sewers and stuff like that and coming up through the toilets in the lower levels. I don't think we've ever actually seen that. I feel like there was a Bad Batch or Clone Wars episode where there was definitely like a Dianoga in just some standing water.
In the wreckage of a starship, which
That's
again,
right.
that is maybe not urban, but it's definitely a settled environment, that it's an artificial environment. The Dianoga aboard the Death Star, how did that get there? It clearly is thriving. It's big enough to try and eat Luke, but was that somebody's pet that got washed down, or was it intentionally there, or was it just a complete accident?
Right. So we didn't start off by asking you, Sawyer, but I'm curious about your Star Wars background. Did you grow up with it? What sort of got you into it? And then how you transitioned into like the sciencey parts of it, James and I love so much.
So yeah, I grew up with Star Wars. I can't remember the first movie that I saw. I'm gonna guess it was probably The Phantom Menace because I grew up around the time of the prequels releasing, and I'd say Attack of the Clones is probably the one I watched the most growing up. My favorite is always going to be Return of the Jedi, and I've just always been a major Star Wars fan. I didn't even consider making Star Wars related content until the sequel trilogy. I think that really cemented me into the fandom in ways that I hadn't really interacted before because I didn't start doing the whole fandom thing until I was in middle school. Oh, when the pandemic hit, a lot of people started making content when the pandemic hit. But for me, it wasn't I didn't start out with the science stuff. I was in college at the time, starting my degree. And I actually had an unconventional introduction to that as well. I enrolled in college as a French major with no interest in science whatsoever. And I had this like life-changing field trip to Peru that I came home and I was a scientist all of a sudden.
Yay.
Yeah, I started doing a lot of trends, a lot of memes. That was kind of what was in 2020, that peak time for Star Wars TikTok. And when that wasn't feeding my soul, I started reading Star Wars books because I had never been exposed to those before. And I was like, whoa, this is a completely new world. And these stories are just as lively, if not more so, than the films. And there's so much knowledge here. And finally, I started doing a lot of lore, a lot of Old Republic stuff. And it dawned on me one day that I had this opportunity to combine my two worlds and talk about of course, Star Wars is fiction, but all fiction that exists on this planet is informed by reality in some way. So I started with Jabba the Hutt. I thought, what can I learn about the Hutt species that people will lose their minds over? I discovered that he has a marsupial pouch for no reason.
Oh.
And they also have a radula, like snails, and that's how they digest their food. And so I just kind of made a word vomit video about the biology of Jabba the Hutt, and that was my first video to do over 1 million views. It blew up.
Wow.
I was like, wait, this is so fun. So yeah, I did a whole series of the Star Wars biology videos. A lot of it was just kind of articulating information that had already been put out into the universe. A lot of it comes from old Star Wars TTRPGs,
Awesome.
species books for character building and whatnot. After a while, I was like, wait a second. At this point, I was getting close to getting my degree. I knew I was going to grad school. I knew that science was going to be my career. I thought, gosh, at least in my experience, I find that once a year or twice a year, maybe, the same few questions come up in the Star Wars fandom. One of them being, what the heck is up with Jason Syndulla? And why is his biology the way that it is?
Yes.
And so I used that as an opportunity to make an educational video about what a Punnett square is and the very basics of Mendelian genetics. And that did really well. And people would always ask me, like, oh, if you become a professor, are you going to make your students learn about Star Wars biology, even though it's not real? And I was like thinking, like, well, I think that science education is so important. And especially being a herpetologist, I think humans, there is like an inherently selfish thing about us where when we talk about climate change, the conversation is always surrounding us and how we're going to survive. But the reality is we are survivalists. We'll make it out for as long as we can, but these other species have far worse a shot. We don't spend enough time talking about how these other species that are fundamental to our ecosystems and the way that we are able to enjoy life the way that we do. And I thought, gosh, I could actually get people to care about this if I start talking about real science concepts through the lens of fiction. Because, yeah, it's fiction and it's silly, and there's absolutely no reason that Jabba the Hutt needs to have a marsupial pouch. But I can start talking about real things like, let me teach you about ecosystems. Let me teach you about biomes. Let me teach you about the difference between an invasive and an introduced species. But we're going to make it fun. And we're going to talk about Star Wars.
Oh, yeah. You definitely don't have to justify that concept to us. I feel like I'm constantly pre-defending myself of like, but it's fun. I love doing this. This enhances my fandom to like take these sorts of deep dives. Whereas other people are like, just enjoy it. I'm like, I am enjoying it.
We're enjoying it a lot. That this was also a pandemic project that got started.
It's true.
You mentioned some of the species that would be really threatened by climate change. Are there examples of those in urban areas that we should know about?
In the real world?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a little biased, obviously, as a herpetologist, but I think that something that is very fascinating about reptiles is the fact that they're ectothermic. And they're also very highly abundant in a lot of cases. The lizards I study, anoles, geckos, they make a fantastic model. Because if an ectotherm is unable to self-regulate as temperatures rise and the climate changes, that tells you a lot about how warm-blooded animals are doing and how just beyond that, even insects, we can gauge a lot. If a lizard's not doing well, and a lizard has a lot of different ways that it can self-regulate. It can crawl in a hole. It can pant. I don't know if people know this. Lizards pant the same way that dogs do. It can do its best to adapt to different environments to get out of the sun. It can learn to cling to metal when it used to cling to trees. There are a lot of things that lizards have done to try to survive climate change. If the lizards aren't doing great, high chance that everything else is not doing so hot either. Probably doing worse. Right. So I don't work on any species myself that are like critically endangered or at risk of going before we do. And thankfully, even though I do spend a lot of time in the thermal ecology region of urban ecology, I have yet to encounter a species that is that level of critically endangered. Everything I've studied is good for at least the next 50 years. But that's just talking about temperature.
Yeah.
Right.
Random lizard question. When a lizard is doing push-ups, is that heat regulation or is that something else?
No, that is very much I'm stronger and better and you should come over and hang out in my den because that guy's a loser.
Right. That's a hey girl.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I should do more push-ups.
More push-ups.
I'll get all the female lizards.
Yeah, you were talking about lizards in like urban environments already, but I'm trying to remember what the term is. It like indicator species or something like that? Like I remember hearing that about a lot of newts and stuff like that. Like they're the first ones to pick up on temperature or acidic levels or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Newts would be amphibians, but absolutely their skin is porous. If the newts are dying, there's something bad in the water.
Right. Okay.
They're not being shot by a newt gun ray.
I knew it was coming. You got a little bit of a spit take out of Sawyer. There's something about his voice that changes. I'm like, here comes a pun. But that was a good one, actually. I like it.
I appreciate the thumbs up, Sawyer.
Well, I'm trying to think of other urban environments. So there's Corellia, which I mean, I love the movie Solo, so I really enjoyed time there. I don't really remember any skittering creatures.
looking at all the films, there aren't a whole lot of urban environments in the films other than Coruscant and then a couple
Yeah.
towns on Tatooine. And then I guess like Theed and Oto Gunga.
Yeah, but I guess you could say, I mean, I would love to see a xenobiologist within universe talking about the urban landscape of Otogunga because of the fish. The fish would have to be considered urban species to some extent, just to
Oh, yeah.
coexist where there is a city underwater. And there's a lot of transport underwater as well that interferes with the everyday life of these aquatic animals.
Right.
The
I
other
think,
one that I thought of was Cantonica, Cantobite.
oh, yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, because it's a very ritzy place and it's got that artificial lake, but there's got to be stuff living in that
Oh,
lake.
yeah.
Every built environment will have its equivalents of, rats or raccoons or pigeons or starlings or
Right.
bugs and lizards and stuff. I'm just trying to think of like Coruscant, we know there's such things as like hawk bats and concrete slugs. I would guess that probably in the Star Wars universe, there are species that have completely adapted to like eating plastic and
Hmm.
metal
Or
and such.
yeah, I mean like the Minox, right? Eating electricity or, those sorts of things too.
Yeah.
Things that I don't know maybe there's something that can eat hyperspace energy or something like that. So that'd be really, really interesting to see. There's like another wildlife guide coming out in October that I like have pre-ordered and can't wait to get my hands on because I'm really hoping now that there's some urban environments included in that, not just the, wide open spaces like Dagobah. Well, and we don't really have anything equivalent to like Cloud City. I was trying to think of, sort of toxic environments. Although I guess it's not toxic. I mean, Lando is just walking around out on the landing pads and stuff like that. But, just something so different that like we can't even think of what type of animals would live there.
I'd imagine that even though that the station is a big mining colony, but there's, a lot of, probably well-to-do people, and there's probably parks and such. I'm guessing that there's some kind of avians flying around. Here in San Diego, there's some feral flocks of parrots that fly over certain communities. They just started off as a couple parrots that probably got away from somewhere, and then they just got bigger and bigger. So I can imagine some things like that in Cloud City or other places where it's like if they can find food, the ones that can adapt and survive off of whatever they want. And then if they look cute, they get fed.
Right.
Yeah, I think an interesting example, I'm trying to think back through all the different planets that we've spent a considerable amount of time on. In Star Wars, we have all kinds of different sentient species, right? One of them being Wookiees. What does urban ecology look like on Kashyyyk, where there are cities, there are villages, but everything's made out of wood?
Oh my God, I didn't even remember that, but you're right. I bet there's a lot more termites.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the holiday special now, which I have fully blocked out from my brain. I was like, are there any mentions of pets or creatures or anything in that horrifying 90 minutes of television?
Well, I was researching things on Kashyyyk for a different thing, and I came across they have wood lice, which are lice, but
Okay.
they live in trees rather than on animals. And I was like, how does that work? But maybe they started off as parasitic lice, and then they started eating something on trees as opposed to sucking blood or whatever lice
Right.
do.
Yeah, you adapt to the niche that is going to help you live the longest, right? So I could see that.
What types of creatures are there in urban environments in terms of like what roles they fit into the overall ecology?
Well, in the real world, we have a lot of vermin, rodents. I live in New York City, so a lot of rats everywhere. Yeah, you're gonna have like bottom feeder type species that can thrive off of gaining nutrients from eating trash. But you're also gonna have species like there's quite a few birds in urban environments. They're able to scope out what limited foliage is available to them. We've even seen, of course, some bird species be able to nest on urban buildings and such.
Right.
We got squirrels that kind of fits a little bit into the vermin category. No offense to any squirrel lovers, but they do thrive in cities for a reason. And then you're going to have a lot of smaller animals that can occupy a wide variety of different microhabitats within a city. That's what I think is so cool about lizards, because you could have the same species of lizard occupying 10 different microhabitats in the same city, like 10 individual populations of the same species of lizard adapted just slightly differently. And you could go and you could do a study and see if there was any kind of subtle adaptation that these different populations had to adapt to these different areas, whether it be a difference in light availability, difference in shade, difference in nutrients that they're taking. Right now, I'm working with C. elegans, which is a species of roundworm that is used in a lot of genetic research, human genome research, actually. And it's incredible how a roundworm, which is a microscopic organism, has adapted to occupy a variety of different substrates. You can find them on a flower, you can find the same species on a piece of fruit, you can find them in urban grass or like in a dirty stream of water. It's just, I think that species that reproduce quickly and frequently are more likely to thrive in urban environments because their turnaround time, I guess, to put it in layman's terms, is quicker for adaptation. And you can see it. I just did a fieldwork project in Puerto Rico where we were X-raying the toes of the same species of lizard. We took urban populations and forest populations, and we were X-raying their toes and then taking a picture of their toes as well, like a microscopic image of their toes. With this particular species, you didn't even need the X-ray. You could see that there was a morphology difference.
Wow.
In the size and shape of the urban lizards versus the rural forest lizards, which is really, really cool. So because the urban lizards needed to climb onto mostly concrete and metal poles and not trees, they have larger and longer toes.
That's interesting.
What are some other adaptations that animals in an urban setting might develop?
Sometimes it can be physiological. We see in a lot of the temperature work that I do. Right now, I have just one strain of the same species of worms. It is just not growing at the standard temperature for this particular species. And I brought it to my advisor yesterday, and he said, oh, well, we took the sample at the very lowest and very hottest area of Micronesia. And what we think happened is these guys are just so used to the urban thermal pressures in their environment that the 25 degrees Celsius, which is about room temperature, is too cold for them. And so now we're seeing if I put them in a hotter incubator, are they going to reproduce? Are they naturally adapted to that? So there's a lot of physiological stuff in regards to temperature shifting, what a species can or cannot tolerate. I did a study in Peru a few years back, and we expected these lizards to be out within maybe a 10-degree temperature difference, and they went all the way up to like 25 degrees hotter than their normal temperature, which is really great for species in high elevations like that because they don't have a lot of room to move if the temperature increases. But so yeah, morphological changes, physiological changes. We can even see some behavioral changes as well. That's more about resource availability. Do lizards maybe become more aggressive because their resources are scarce? Or do they become more aggressive because they are introduced to invasive species that are becoming competition? What does that look like? Is there a change in their bite force? That's something I'd really like to study at some point. Is a lizard having to develop a stronger jaw because of the resource change as urban landscapes develop?
As yet another reason we should do something about climate changes, lizards might get greater bite force.
I'm really curious if this bite force study happens because I'm like, how do you do that?
You can test it. This is a very real thing that herpetologists can test. There's a little thingamajig that you just get the lizard to bite and it'll measure the bite force.
Is it somebody's pinky?
I'm definitely picturing, the cheap version of this is how quickly you say ow when something bites you. But it's like there's probably little shock pads or something.
I'd be impressed if any of the lizards that I work with could elicit an ow from me.
Okay.
They're very tiny. But in reference to species they're competing with, I definitely think there could be a difference.
Well, when we were talking about, urban environments, I kind of want to step back and at what point is something considered an urban environment? I guess here on Earth, a little bit, when we're talking about Star Wars, Coruscant is pretty obvious. The whole planet is a city. But, when we're talking about Kashyyyk, at what point does that count as urban if it's all, the Ewok village, is that urban if they're using all sort of like natural things? At some point, is it a settlement? So I'm curious if there's like a definition of where that line changes.
In my professional opinion, I would say that if Kashyyyk existed in the real world, that would not be considered in urban ecology, at least not the urban ecology that I study. The rules are different when it comes to Star Wars, which is why I brought it up. But I think that there is an emphasis on the proportion of man-made structures to natural resources, as well as what is the human population, what does transportation look like in the area.
I don't know.
Wookiee
I'd
made.
argue that the cities of Kashyyyk do count as urban. I think it's wherever sentients are in enough density that it makes an ecological impact. That, like you said, it's the high population, the resources change. That so it's like even we consider farming areas not to be urban, but the humans have changed the land, and some animals might thrive because they do better in monocrop farmland than other species that maybe need a variety of things. Or it's like, oh hey, we're building phone lines in places, and now that gives instant high points, vantage points for predatory birds and such.
Right.
Those are just really small things, but as you add more and more people, it still keeps building up. And even cultures that build using natural stuff like Ewoks or in harmony with nature, there's still going to be a shift. So maybe urban is not really what I'm going for, just settled or
Right. Is city and urban, are they the same thing? Or can you have a city that's not urban, I guess? Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I think, again, resource availability is a huge factor in all of this. I think you're right, James. If resources are being utilized differently by a species that has control over how the resources can be distributed, then that's a great argument for that. Absolutely.
Here on this planet, the role of sentience is both we're causing it, but also can save it. And I'm curious in Star Wars, like there hasn't really been a lot of discussion other than Alderaan, obviously, catastrophically blowing up, but, of the role of man-made, empire-made habitat destruction like that.
I do like this question. That's if sentience disappeared, how would the ecosystem change? I think that's a question that people in my field ask a lot. I think that is in some ways related to the goal. Who's going to inherit the earth? And if we are not the ones who inherit the earth, are we leaving the earth to be heritable for whatever is left? I point to the Acolyte for this because I was thinking of episode 7 of we have the Jedi, they find this virgin, so they're like, there was no life on this planet, but all of a sudden there was life on this planet. We know that that had something to do with the witches, possibly, probably, but they were concentrated to one area and the rest of the planet was entirely flourishing. And Brendock, we are to assume, because it's mentioned that it was destroyed in the hyperspace disaster from the High Republic, we're to assume that this was a populated planet beforehand. So yeah, what happens? How do things adapt? And I think that while scientists cannot tell the future, I think that we can ask questions about the future that can point us in a better direction than what it would be without interference from biologists, from climate change activists, people doing the work to try to protect the planet. And, it's kind of a weird position to be in because I think humans are destroying the planet, but also humans have the potential to save it.
Right.
I'm rooting for the lizards. I do think that the lizards might inherit the earth.
I like that. Well, and you did talk about it a little bit earlier in terms of lizards are already adapting, to urban environments, which is something I hadn't really thought of. They can continue to adapt. And yeah, the discussions we have are mostly about what will happen to humans and not what will happen to the species that can't adapt, that don't have, that wide temperature range or whatever at minimum that they can survive in.
But we can also see things like the Masasi temples on Yavin 4, where there was clearly somebody had settled there a long time ago, and now it's kind of been reclaimed by the jungle and then converted by the rebels to be their base. But it's kind of a change of ecosystem. Maybe there were a lot of critters there that they're like, oh, we can't coexist with these things. We got to get them out of these pyramids.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've watched the kids animal cartoon show, the YouTube series, The Galaxy of Creatures, but there's definitely an episode where they're like on Hoth in the abandoned rebel base or whatever. And yeah, the animals have like taken back over and they're like, the Tauntauns are like, it's awesome in here, right? Like there's no snow, and I love that because that's exactly, I feel like what would happen.
No, I think you can make that inference just a little bit. I think about my time in Florida and how on any given day, a lizard's going to be in your house doing something, just chilling, hanging on the windowsill. crawling into your laundry basket, whatever it is. And then I think of, post-apocalyptic video games I've played where it's like that. There's just cockroaches and creatures everywhere. I think that what we can glean from the study of urban ecology is that, not to be cliche, but life does find a way. If you need a tagline for this episode, urban ecology is essentially life finds a way.
Love it.
I'm just
But,
now
yeah.
imagining those kind of axolotl mutant hybrids from Fallout.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I wrote an article about the gulper and the implications of that. And actually, not to get too off topic here, but I'm a big fan of the science that went into the Last of Us story and how accurate it is. Back when when the HBO adaptation was coming out, I was making videos. Like, my prediction, very much just from my background, is that while we will not see a cordyceps infection in humans in our lifetime, it will reach amphibians because amphibians are so fragile and they're so susceptible. There's already chytrid, which is a fungus that infects and has wiped out so many frogs. And then a couple months ago, there was a frog found. It was kind of frustrating for the scientific community because whoever found this frog was not a scientist, so they didn't think to keep the frog or whatever, but they found a frog that had a mushroom growing out of the top of its head, and it seemed fine. It did not seem infected by this fungus, but I'm telling you, it's gonna happen.
Right.
It's a real life Bulbasaur.
Oh, there you go.
It's a very upbeat way of looking at it.
Right. Yeah. Not that it's the harbinger of The Last of Us, which is much more where my fatalist, I guess, brain went. Well, tell us about your favorite Star Wars character.
Oh, okay. I'm exposing myself here a little bit. No, honestly, for a very, very, very long time, my favorite Star Wars character has been Ben Solo. I truly resonate with his story on a very deeply personal level. And I think the nuance with which Adam Driver portrayed the character was executed beautifully, even in moments where the character wasn't given a lot to work with. However, I have been entirely captivated by this Chimere stranger character in The Acolyte, and I wasn't sure how I was going to feel as the series wrapped up. No spoilers, of course, but I think he has the potential to take that top spot.
So
I like a baddie.
Should we be concerned about you?
No, it doesn't have to mean anything.
No, I think with Chimere, I think what is so interesting about his character is, first of all, I don't think he's the villain of the story. I think the truth is the villain of the story. No, I think that what Leslie Headland set out to do with the Acolyte was to frame the Sith and the dark side in a different light, and not necessarily in like a manipulative or look at all the bad things the dark side does. I think that she was very heavily inspired by the Old Republic Sith and the questions that they ask about the dark side and what that means, and passion and desire and love a little bit, I'm also a huge fan of the High Republic and all of the characters in that story. And I just think Chimere there's just so much there. There's so much room to play with that character in a comic series, in a book or something. I think that probably there's a lot more backstory to him in her notes than what we are able to see on screen.
Oh,
and I am
definitely.
There's just something about him and the way that she portrayed the dark side through his character that is so fascinating to me. So I'll hold off. I'll say Ben Solo, but he's getting up there.
Yeah.
So we should get you a helmet.
Right. I did like that it gave a reason to have a helmet. Like, even, because it was like Darth Vader obviously needs one to like breathe and function or whatever. And so when Kylo Ren had one, I was like, is it just to look dramatic, to like keep your hair out of your face? Like, what is it? And I like that in the Acolyte, it was like, oh no, it's sensory deprivations.
Yeah,
it's can like live through me. And I was like, hey.
it's the opposite of Vader's. Vader's is to bring in the outside world, so we can see, and it enhances everything from the outside. And the stranger's helmet is the opposite. It shuts out the outside world.
Yeah, I just couldn't get over, because to me, the actor is from The Good Place, playing such a ding dong from like Jacksonville, Florida or whatever, that I just, every time that character was on screen, I was still like, Bortles.
If somebody was interested in getting into your field, how would you recommend them going about that?
Oh, that's a great question. Listen, I got lucky. I'll be completely honest. I was at the right place at the right time. Like I said earlier, I did not go into college for science. I went for like a pre-law sort of French international studies type deal. I ended up at a wonderful liberal arts college where I could explore whatever I wanted to. And I ran into this amazing woman, Dr. Tiffany Doan, my mentor, incredible herpetologist, dear friend of mine who introduced this trip to Peru that we did and introduced me to the world of science. I would say that if someone is truly passionate about biology and wants to explore what they can do with that degree beyond just medical school, because I think that there are a lot, including myself, a lot of people who pursue a STEM degree with the intent to go to medical school. The unfortunate reality, especially in the United States, is that students are rarely exposed to what scientists actually do.
Mhm.
My job is to go to wonderful, amazing places and catch lizards and play with lizards and then put them back and set them free and then take the data that I've gotten and turn that into real science and real information that helps policymakers, that helps other scientists, that helps students, that helps the world. If you can, you must try to do an REU or find a mentor who is willing to show you what science actually looks like. That is the best advice that I could give anybody. An REU, it's run by the National Science Foundation, which is a fantastic organization that gives a lot of grants to grad students and professionals. The REU stands for Research Experiences for Undergraduates, and every winter they get posted and you can apply the same way that you would apply for a grant or anything else like that. And then they fly you out and you get to work in a real science lab over the summer. You don't take classes or anything usually. It's usually just a hands-on science project. You're usually working directly with a PI, a primary investigator, or perhaps a postdoc, or perhaps a PhD student, but it's real hands-on experience in whatever field you want to explore. And it's a very fantastic opportunity if you're unable to do actual research in your undergrad program.
Cool. Great advice. Well, where can we find you on social media, your science publications, things like that?
Yeah, you can read Hot Lizards, which is a publication that was posted in 2022 in the Journal of Ichthyology and Herpetology. That's a favorite of mine. I have another paper coming out hopefully by the end of the year, and that will be in the Journal of North American Herpetology. In terms of content, you can find me at Sawyeurism pretty much anywhere the internet exists. Every social media platform, that is my username, Sawyeurism. I post on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and I also am the host of the Yap Sesh podcast, which is a very dear passion project with my good friend Brooke. And that show is dedicated to highlighting diverse perspectives in fandom and showcasing especially the queer and femme sides of fandom that get overlooked a lot of the time. So please check us out on Spotify, YouTube, the Yap Sesh podcast.
How do you spell that?
Yapsesh, it's YAP space SESH.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for spending some time talking Star Wars and science with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Sawyer Markham, and we want to thank all of you for listening. San Diego Comic-Con is coming up this weekend, depending on when you're listening to this. We have several cool things going on at Comic-Con. I am hosting the Science of Futurama panel on Thursday at noon in Brand Ballrooms 10 and 11 at the Marriott Marquis.
Yes. So I am hosting a panel Sunday at 2 p.m. with some science advisors. So the science advisor for Star Trek, the MCU, and some Disney animation. Also in the Marriott Grand Ballroom, room 1011. And then Star Warsologies is teaming up with Nerd Night San Diego and the San Diego Science Writers Association and Cosplay for Science to put on a science mixer. So we just always want to chat and answer more science and pop culture questions. So we're just going to be at the Marriott South Pool patio Saturday of Comic-Con from 4 to 7 p.m. If you want to just come out, buy yourself a drink, and chat science with a bunch of nerds, geeks, and anyone who's in town. Come out and say hi. So we'd love to meet you in person. And if you're listening to this after all of these things have happened, we'll have those panel recordings up as episodes. All right. Well, if you're looking for the links we talked about in this show, check out our show notes page, which is at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our Star Warsologies YouTube channel, where we post episodes with some related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's StarWarsologies @gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook, the Star Warsologies podcast fan group. So join today and chat with us and your fellow listeners.
And please also make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and share it with your friends.
No topic is off limits, even whether Jar Jar's tongue or Vernestra's light whip can tie themselves into knots.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Max FX podcast, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. They'll also be at San Diego Comic-Con, so look for them. And they also have a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies with our awesome San Diego Comic-Con panels.
Comic-Con!
Comic-Con! Woo!